If you've watched a few videos on this channel, then you'll know I'm no fan of the way the MCU treats its villains.
You know, with the benefit of hindsight. And I will not be bullied by that. I am the Mandarin!
Yep, definitely not a fan. See, I've got this theory, right? That when you're watching a superhero film or TV show, whatever, you should be as fearful of the villains as you are inspired by the heroes. In essence, you should be as invested in the villain's story as you are in the hero's story. Radical idea, huh? Though lately, a lot of villains are treated like a total afterthought. I can't tell you the amount of superhero flicks I've sat down to watch in the last few years where I felt literally nothing towards the main villain. Like, totally apathetic. Didn't hate them, didn't like them, didn't find them interesting, compelling, nothing. It feels like now villains have to be either quirky or comedic or just dumb. Like somewhere along the way, writers forgot that villains were actually meant to be characters in their own right, that the audience was meant to find them interesting. Now that's not to say that every villain on the big or small screen has been a total strikeout, not at all. But it feels like for every Bullseye or Kingpin or Killmonger, villains that writers actually gave fully fleshed out characters to, there's been about 17 Malekiths or Aldrich Killians. I'm not calling him the Mandarin. And this brings me nicely to Oswald Cobblepot. Oz Cobb from the HBO Max Batman spin-off series The Penguin. This right here is how you write a compelling villain. Oz Cobb is a lot of things, man. He's a caring guy, he loves his mom, he's a hard worker just trying to carve out a name for himself in the Gotham underworld, but he's also kind of a sadist. A ruthless killer. And a schemer who will literally use anyone and discard them the second he doesn't need them any longer. In any given episode, except maybe that last one, you can see Oz Cobb do the most messed up stuff, just the most despicable shit. But at the end of that episode, you're still rooting for him. You still like him. The writers want you to like Oz at the start of the series and throughout the show, but they want you to absolutely hate him by the end of it. And man, do they ever pull this off. The first episode is probably one of the best introductions to a character I've seen in a long time. Within the first 15 minutes, you find out exactly the kind of man that Oz Cobb is. You learn how he sees the world. You see how he wants other people to perceive him.
Can you imagine to be remembered like that? Revered.
You see how other people actually perceive him.
Oswald Cobb! Remember him? What a guy!
And you also see some flaws, like how he often doesn't think things fully true. The Penguin is a show about a villain, 100%. The Penguin is an antagonist of Batman, who is our actual protagonist in this universe. But for the purposes of this show, the Penguin, Oz Cobb, is now our protagonist, and as such, the writers can't have him be a total monster. At least not at the start. Remember, we're going to be spending 8 hours with this guy, so he has to have some redeeming features. The audience actually has to find him somewhat relatable and even likable. So how do you make a character as despicable as Oz Cobb actually is, relatable? Well, that's easy enough. You just show the audience his vulnerable side. Now, if The Penguin was a show airing on Disney+, making Oz relatable would mean having the Penguin's characterization take a hard turn into anti-hero or reluctant hero territory. And before you know it, the Penguin would be this misunderstood crime boss who isn't actually such a bad guy after all, and he'd probably only have been a scumbag drug dealer because he was mind-controlled into it by Carmine Falcone. But unlike the writers on the Book of Boba Fett or Loki though, the writers on The Penguin don't try to downplay the villainous side of Oz's personality to make you like him more or make him more relatable. Oz is still portrayed as a monster, but he's a monster who cares for his mom. He's a monster who takes pity on a stuttering kid who is trying to steal from him. Oz is shown as a guy who was given an unfair hand in life. Oz is shown to be the underdog who other gangsters look down on and laugh at. The writers make you see Oz as a kind of almost sympathetic guy at the start. Yeah, sure, he's a criminal and a killer, but he's a criminal and a killer in a world of criminals and killers. But over the course of the season, the writers strip back Oz's character more and more, and you're shown that Oz's relationship with his mother, the relationship that humanizes Oz the most in the eyes of the audience, isn't exactly what it appears to be. From Oz's side, the whole relationship is built on this really horrible lie, and Oz is willing to do anything to protect that lie, even if it means letting his own mother be tortured. And from his mother's side, you find out that she's aware of what Oz did when he was younger, and she was originally going to have him killed for it, but then decided not to, and instead put her faith in him that he'd eventually grow up to be a man that would take care of her and provide. And while you see her multiple times throughout the show praise Oz and tell him how much she loves him, Underneath all that, she knows exactly what he is, and she hates him. As the show goes on, you start to see Oz do more increasingly deplorable things until you get to that very last episode, and you see Oz in cold blood strangle Victor, his protege, one of the people he's supposed to care about. Honestly, I was really surprised when I saw Oz do this. I think everyone was. But here's the thing, we really shouldn't have been surprised by this at all. The whole sympathetic side to Oz was just this great bait and switch by the writers. They spent the majority of the first part of the season showing you the more vulnerable side of Oz's character, the caring side, the human side, only to recontextualize all of his sympathetic actions in the latter half of the season as the actions of a self-serving narcissistic psychopath. You're not supposed to like the Penguin, or root for him. He's a villain. This is the same guy who thinks it's a-okay to sell drugs contaminated by sewer water to addicts. The same guy who burned a mother and her son alive and later gloated about it. The same guy who left his own brothers to drown. The same guy who was going to let his mother be tortured rather than admit the truth of what he did as a child. The writers just made you forget who this guy was for a bit. Oz killing Victor in the last episode was them just reminding you of who this guy has always been. A villain. We've had pretty much zero good villain representation on screen for a while now in the superhero space, but then all at once we get two shows running concurrently delivering some of the best villain characterizations I've seen in years. Let's talk about Lex Luthor, played by Michael Cudlitz on Superman and Lois. The best word I can use to describe Michael Cudlitz's Lex Luthor is presence. This guy has buckets of presence. The writers on Superman and Lois knew what they were doing with this guy. Ever before we clap eyes on Lex Luthor in this show, the writers were bigging this guy up as a serious threat. There's worried snatches of dialogue here and there about Lex Luthor's upcoming parole board hearing peppered throughout Season 3, but it's not until the 12th episode of the season that we actually get to see Lex for the first time, and he's not anything like you would think he would be. General audiences know who Lex Luthor is. They've seen him on television and on film a bunch of times already, but audiences haven't seen this Lex Luthor before. They've never seen Lex Luthor like this before. They've never seen Lex Luthor as an angry, violent man hardened by years behind bars. This is a Lex Luthor who runs the prison he's incarcerated in with an iron fist. Every inmate stands to attention in his presence. The prison warden hand delivers his mail to him. All of this entire introduction, all 60 seconds of it, is a masterclass in how to build up a villain with almost zero dialogue being spoken. Everything shown to you in this introduction paints Lex Luthor as a man you do not want to mess with, a man to be feared. There's a lot more going on in this episode with Lex too, what I've described as just 1 minute of footage. I don't want to spoil any of the other great moments the writers give Lex in this episode. It's kind of his origin story. Episode 12 is great, by the way, so check it out for yourself. It's one of the best episodes in the entire series. The first thing Lex does once he gets out of jail is put on his expensive watch, pry his wedding band off his finger, look at a picture of his daughter, and then start walking. It's not until the end of the episode we find out where he's actually walking to. He was walking to the Kent farm to confront Lois Lane, the person who put him in jail 17 years ago. What follows is probably one of the strongest scenes in the series, and probably the most definitive Lex Luthor moment across all of his appearances in live action. Lex just lays it all out straight for Lois, threatening her family, swearing retribution on her for stealing 17 years of his life. Lex Luthor feels like a real person. He's not just a villain. He's a very flawed guy with a very twisted worldview. And in episode 5 of season 4, we get a peek behind the curtain of just how flawed this guy really is, and why Lex is the way he is. A lot of what motivates Lex in the first part of season 4 is his search for his daughter, Elizabeth. He desperately wants to be part of her life and make up for all the time he's lost. In episode 5, he finally gets the opportunity to talk to her for the first time in 17 years. And it's here in these scenes we come to see why Lex is so obsessed with ruining Lois Lane's life.
I didn't kill those people.
No. No, but you've done other things. Killed other people.
All lies. Lies spread by Lois Lane.
As Elizabeth points out, Lex was innocent of the crimes he was sentenced to jail for, but that doesn't mean he was innocent either. He didn't kill the people he was accused of, sure, but he's killed plenty of people all the same. Lex hates Lois Lane because it's easier for him to project all of the blame onto her for being sent away than it is for him to acknowledge that he was in that situation in the first place, at least in part, because he was a criminal and a killer. Like Lois Lane said at the end of episode 12,
I was wrong about what happened to Moxie, but I wasn't wrong about what you are.
All this hatred and all this rage he puts onto Lois, it's at least in part projection. It's easier for Lex to blame Lois for all of his problems than it is for him to take accountability for his own actions and move forward with his life. I have to think that deep down Lex knows that if he was just a legitimate businessman, if he was content with that, and if he wasn't involved in crime, he never would have ended up in the frame for the crimes he was accused of. Elizabeth eventually offers Lex an ultimatum. He can be a part of her life, but only if he chooses to walk away from his vendetta and his rage. But he just won't do it, or can't do it. His hatred and anger just won't allow him to. Lex decides to sacrifice his relationship with his daughter and his grandson, rather than break his own cycle of hatred and rage, because he knows that breaking that cycle would involve him having to acknowledge his own failings and bad decisions. His denial of the truth, his ego and his stubbornness prevent him from being able to move forward in his life and have the things he wants. He's basically exiled himself into this endless cycle of hatred and bitterness. And none of this is spelled out to us either. It's all shown to us in Michael Cudlitz's brilliant portrayal. Lex is the reason his life fell apart. Lex is the reason he was sent to jail, and deep down, he knows this. And when any chance of having a relationship with his daughter totally falls apart, he handles this news about as well as you'd expect a man like him would. He just starts smashing everything around him. Again, this is just a really good example of how poor Lex is in dealing with his own issues. Lex is a corporate and criminal genius in this show, a master manipulator. But when a situation doesn't go his way, this is how he handles it. I was confused the first time I saw him just start doing push-ups in the middle of trashing his room, and then I realized, oh yeah, he's doing push-ups because that's what prison inmates do, to release stress. I love moments like this where you can see the writers incorporating small touches that hint at the character's past. What's really great about this characterization too is the subtle character building work the writers added in here. You might think this room is like this because Lex trashed it, but actually no, this is where Lex has chosen to live. This guy is worth how many untold billions of dollars, and this rundown dump is where he chooses to live. Why did he pick this particular spot to live in? Because it's right across the street from the Smallville Gazette, where Lois Lane works. This shows you just how consumed this guy is with hatred, how obsessed he is. It shows you how all his anger and hatred has basically consumed him and is actively ruining his life. Lex could go anywhere, do anything. He's just after getting out of jail after serving a 17-year bid, but this is where he chooses to stay, just so he can torture the people he believes did him wrong. This is brilliant character building, man. This is how you write a compelling character. Notice how I didn't say villain, I said character, and that's an important distinction. Scenes like Lex obviously lying to himself when speaking to his daughter or him trashing his room tell you so much about his character. You see, this is actual interesting character work, unlike whatever the this was supposed to be. When Lex rejects Elizabeth's offer, he starts to spiral out of control pretty quickly. He comes off the rails fast after this. Lex Luthor has always been portrayed in the various iterations as a guy who is consumed by his hatred for Superman, but also as a guy who cares deeply about the empires he's built, both criminal and legitimate. Here Lex is no longer interested in his business empire. He doesn't care about it anymore. He cared about it after getting out of jail only so far as it enabled him to further his mission against Lois. But after things go bad with Elizabeth, he stops caring about any of his business interests. Once he gets back to Metropolis, he signs over controlling interest of LexCorp over to his second-in-command. At this point, he is practically consumed by his hatred, and it's when he becomes this consumed that he starts to become unhinged. This is the beginning of Lex's downfall. Lex Luthor, a guy who doesn't take any action without planning it out first, goes totally off-book and decides to destroy Smallville because the people who lived there sided with Clark over him. Now this might sound like a total supervillain move, but honestly, when you see how consumed by rage and hatred and bitterness this guy is, his rapid descent into madness makes a lot of sense. I'm not going to give the ending away, but I will say that Lex's story and character arc on Superman and Lois isn't defined by him solely being a villain. Lex's story is also a cautionary tale of how anger and hatred can ruin a person's life, and that's equally as interesting as seeing Lex donning the war suit and going toe-to-toe with Superman. Without giving anything away, the last shot we see of Lex Luthor on Superman and Lois is this one. A broken man crying his eyes out sitting alone at a table. This is the face of a man who regrets everything he's done, and it closes out his character arc on this show beautifully, without a single word being spoken. Brilliant. You start off seeing Lex as this intimidating, powerful guy, but the more you learn about him as the show goes on, the more you feel bad for him. The more you come to understand that he's just a guy who's the victim of a bad environment and a broken home. The more you learn about him, the more you come to pity him and realize he never really stood a chance. This version of Lex is also probably the best example of how to reinterpret a character. Forget the Mark Zuckerberg Lex Luthor from BVS. This is how you reinterpret a character while still holding true to the aspects of the character that make them compelling. I have to admit, in a lot of ways I'm a comic book purist, but I do also believe that when a character is adapted to the screen, especially one that's been adapted this many times, the writers really should try to do something new and different with the character that we haven't seen before. Sometimes this can really work, like here, and sometimes it really doesn't work, like here. The writers on Superman and Lois really do put an interesting spin on Lex's characterization here. Like I said, the core concept and personality of Lex Luthor are here, and they're on full display. The intelligence, the obsessive nature, the hatred, the arrogance, the intensity, the ego. The writers don't mess with these characteristics. The writers instead tweak Lex's backstory, and this change was done for a very particular reason. Where Lex comes from and how he sees the world on Superman and Lois is directly tied to his upbringing. And it goes a long way to explaining why Lex is as dysfunctional as he is. We get this very quick exchange between Lex and Elizabeth in episode 5, which goes a long way in explaining how traumatic his childhood was. This Lex Luthor didn't come from money. He came from the most crime-ridden slum in Metropolis. His dad left when he was really young and he never knew him. He was also brutalized by his mother as a child. This traumatic upbringing is what shaped Lex into the man he is. During another flashback scene, we see Lex talking to his wife Erica right after he was just served divorce papers. She just can't make the marriage work with him for a very simple reason. Lex never allows her to get close to him. His traumatic childhood has basically closed him off emotionally. He keeps everyone at arm's length, through no fault of his own. He's just unable to really let his guard down around people. This is actually a pretty common behavior from people who come from abusive homes that they exhibit later in life. Lex's early life was defined by survival, and this is an outlook he's never been able to shake. He's never been able to move beyond this. That's why his marriage failed. That's why he involved himself in crime even when he was earning billions from legitimate business. All of this destructive behavior can be traced back to what was hard-coded into him as a kid. This change to Lex's backstory wasn't the only change that the writers made to his character either. They've also significantly tweaked Lex's motivation. So obviously everyone knows that Lex Luthor hates Superman. There's been different reasons for this hatred detailed in the comics over the years. Sometimes the hatred stems directly from Lex's ego, sometimes it's based on Lex's resentment of another guy being more beloved by the citizens of Metropolis. But here the writers have actually gone and kind of given Lex a more understandable reason for being so hateful. Lex Luthor on Superman and Lois was a guy who was wrongly imprisoned for almost 20 years. And while Lex wasn't at all an innocent guy, Lois and Clark are still culpable for having him sent away for crimes he didn't commit. In the comics, Lex hates Superman, and that hatred is still part of the character here in this show, but the writers have changed who that hatred is directed at. On Superman and Lois, Lex's hatred of Superman is more of a byproduct of his hatred of Lois Lane, who he holds personally responsible for wrongly sending him to jail. Lex is more of a villain to Lois in this interpretation than he is a direct villain of Superman himself. That's a pretty monumental change to the established dynamic between Superman and Lex Luthor. The writers took a really big creative swing with this decision, and it 100% works. I'm playing through Spider-Man Miles Morales at the moment. In a direct parallel to Lex Luthor, the main antagonist in Spider-Man Miles Morales is a guy called Simon Krieger. Simon Krieger is probably the best example I can give of how poorly written an antagonist can be. Simon Krieger is a bad man. He runs Roxxon Industries in this universe and he's involved in a lot of shady shit. But we never learn anything about Simon Krieger in the entire game. We don't know why he does all of these bad things, other than because he's greedy, I guess. Wow, what a great motivation. Like Simon Krieger, Lex Luthor is also a bad guy who runs a billion-dollar empire. But on Superman and Lois, the writers then show you why he's a bad guy, how he came to be a bad guy. Sometimes asking these questions can lead to some really interesting stories. Just saying. What I'm trying to point out with this analogy is that villains are only as boring as the writers allow them to be. As we've seen in shows like Superman and Lois and the Penguin, you can tell great, interesting stories with villains. You just have to start thinking of villains as characters first and then develop them from there. There's really no excuse for making a villain boring. You can do great stuff with a villain. It's just I feel like current day writers, they just don't have any interest in developing characters other than the main hero. So a kind of informal video this week, just wanted to put my thoughts out there on Oz Cobb and Lex Luthor. It's just nice to be reminded what villains can be, you know, when the writers can be bothered to make them more than one-dimensional characters. Anyway, Oz Cobb, Lex Luthor, what do you think about these iterations? Sound off in the comments below and let me know. Like, share and subscribe, it really helps out the channel, and as always, thanks for watching.